Hello, welcome back. Matt from MrLiker.com. Today, as the video title suggests, we are looking at Nikons, but not the later autofocus Nikons such as this one. Maybe I'll do this in a later video, and not the amazing Nikon F5, which you may have seen in a previous video, and for completeness, not Nikon rangefinder cameras either, because we've already done that. Today we are talking about Nikon manual focus SLR cameras, and I have a few to show you. Here are two more. So my challenge to myself was to make a video which is a go-to video for everything you need to know when trying to decide whether to buy a Nikon FM, Nikon FE, Nikon FM2, Nikon FE2 or Nikon FM3a. Obviously Nikon released many SLR cameras over the years, but today we're looking at the range of cameras which share the same chassis as the ones we're looking at here. This video is going to be a comprehensive guide in terms of all the camera specifics of all the different versions. So by the end of this video, you'll definitely know, yes, I want to buy this camera, or yes, I want to buy this camera. We'll cover all the details. I'll show you them up close on camera. And then to make the video hopefully a bit more interesting, I'll include a ton of example photos shot with these cameras. If that sounds of interest, grab a chair, join me, and let's get started. So as a quick introduction to this type of cameras, it all began with the Nikon FM. First released in 1977, and this camera is kind of in direct competition to a Canon AE1. For any of you Canon shooters, this is kind of roughly on the same par. And the Nikon FM followed the Nicomat cameras. The earlier Nicomat cameras are said to be much heavier, so this was kind of the modern lightweight replacement as at 1977. Now the design and chassis of this camera proved to be so successful, it was used in all the camera models from 1977 right through to 2006, all using the same basic design. Now if you follow this channel for a while, you may have spotted some of these cameras in previous videos. I included the Nikon FM and the Nikon FE2 in the two videos where I compared an SLR camera versus a rangefinder and the benefits of each. If you've not yet seen those videos, I'll include a link to them in the description below. This may be particularly of interest to rangefinder shooters which wouldn't necessarily consider an SLR camera. As you probably know, I enjoy my Leica cameras, and yet I still shoot with SLRs occasionally, so they do have their benefits. So before we get into the exact detail of all the different camera models, let's take a look at the camera closer up and we'll go through some of the features. So as you can see on this camera, there's no name on the front, so you may not know what it is. But a top tip for anybody looking, for example, on eBay, or if you maybe found a camera in a charity shop or something, on the back you can see there it says FM. That obviously means it's the Nikon FM camera. And for completeness, there you see the FE on the FE version. So what do we have? So if we work from left to right, here is your film rewind crank. To rewind the film, you just lift it up and rewind like so. When you come to unload your film, you need to pull that tab back. So I'm pulling with this finger and then lifting with my finger and thumb together, and that opens the back. We'll come on to that in a second. Let's just finish the top. That symbol there is your film plane symbol. Here's the hot shoe. Next we have obviously the shutter speed dial, and the red number indicates the maximum flash length speed. Here we have our shutter release, which is threaded, so you can use a shutter release cable, and obviously the film advance. Another point worth noting, the red dot, when the lever is in, it locks the shutter. Let me show you. You can take photos when the lever is open, like so. But when the lever is locked, i.e. pushed down, now you cannot take any photos. So the lever has multiple functions. Obviously, one, advancing the film. Two, it would lock the shutter. Now it's unlocked. And number three, the red dot means the light meter is active. So if you leave your camera like this, it will flatten the battery. So make sure when the camera's not in use, lock that down. And that basically means the light meter is turned off and not using your batteries. One other small button I overlooked, that is your multiple exposure button. On the Nikon FM, the multiple exposure or double exposure button is here. So if you watch the shutter counter, normally when you advance, the frame will advance. But if you slide this shutter button, and now when I advance, it doesn't advance the film, it only recocks the shutter. So now I can let go, take my shot, and that'll give me a double exposure. The film counter also resets to 0 when you open the film back. So if we watch, lift the film back, like so, recheck, and And now we're back to the start. And that can be quite helpful because on some of the vintage cameras, you have to manually zero your counter before every roll of film, which I often forget. If you look now in the front of the camera, you have your PC sync port, you have your lens release button. On this side, you have your self timer. Show you how it works. You'd move that down before you take the shot, cock the shutter, take the photo as normal, obviously on something like a tripod or flat surface, and there you go, the self timer triggers the shot. And here is your depth of preview button. And for completeness, the white line on the side of the dial shows you what shutter speed you're currently set at. So for example, for now we're set at 1/60. Also another feature I forgot to mention, here is your ISO film speed dial. What you need to do is you need to lift the outside of the dial. Can you see it lifting slightly? And then try and do it so you can see it. You see the ISO is rotating, so you're lifting and turning. So basically lift and turn to change your ISO, and just turn without lifting to change your shutter speed. That's the same for the Nikon FM and the Nikon FM2. If we look now at the base of the camera, you can see where the optional MD12 motor drive fits. So the drive connects to that screw there to turn the film, and that's where the power connects through. This is your battery cover, and it takes two LR44 batteries, tripod socket, and you press this button before you rewind your film. Just clicking like that, and then rewind as normal. So all these cameras share pretty much the same features from the outside. One difference on the FE models, which you may notice, instead of selecting your ISO here, you're now selecting it here. See, it's now situated around the rewind crank. So this is for the FE and the FE2. This dial is dual function, so you can lift and turn to change the ISO, or you press this small button and rotate to dial in plus minus exposure. So press and turn for exposure, lift and turn for ISO. Other than that, the FE models look the same as the FM model. I guess one difference, all cameras except the FM now have the multiple exposure button here. So you push that across like that. So you hold and advance at the same time. And that is how you do multiple exposure on the FE, FM2, FE2 and the FM3a. So before we get into the finer details, let me just show you an FE next to an FM, just to show you that they are very, very similar. So you have an FM on the bottom and an FE on the top. You see the slightly different design on the top. So the top design of the FE dial design, and the bottom is the FM kind of button design. But otherwise they're more or less identical from the outside. Now there is also a difference on the inside. When you look through a Nikon FM or a Nikon FM2, you have like a red LED diode on the right hand side of the viewfinder with a plus, 0, minus. And what that means is overexposed, correct exposure, underexposed. And all you do is turn your aperture on the lens or the shutter until the light moves to 0 from either plus or minus. That's on the Nikon FM and the Nikon FM2. Now the Nikon FE, Nikon FE2 and Nikon FM3a, when you look through the viewfinder, you have a really nice kind of needle display, very clear on the left hand side. You have two needles. You have like a thicker green transparent needle. That is your current shutter setting. So currently the camera is set to 1/250th of a second, and there is a green needle across the 250 in the viewfinder. You then have a black needle, which is the correct exposure, and what you basically do is move the green needle till it overlaps the black needle, and then you have the correct exposure if you're shooting in manual shutter mode, as I do. Now if we quickly take a look at the Nikon lens, here you have the 50mm f1.2, and what you may notice, it has two aperture scales, a small aperture scale and a normal size aperture scale. The reason I'm telling you this in this video is because when you attach this lens to one of these cameras we're looking at today, when you look through the viewfinder, basically there's a small window here and it's looking down to read off that small line of numbers. And then when you turn the aperture on the lens, there's a small window in the viewfinder. It tells you your current aperture that's set on the lens. So you don't basically need to go, oh, I'm at f2. You can see in the viewfinder that it's at f2, which was quite an advanced design kind of in its time. If I take the lens off, this is quite a heavy lens, nice lens. If I take the lens off, I can try and show you. So there is the window that looks at the aperture scale on the lens. Obviously also we didn't talk about it. Here is your mirror, being an SLR camera. There is your focus screen at the top, and you can see the reflection on the mirror of the type of focus screen we've got today. So that's a split prism screen. I'll talk more about screens in a second. One additional feature on the Nikon FE and Nikon FE2, they have a push button on the center of the shutter dial. What this means is the button moves freely until you get to A, and then it locks. And then to change the setting from A, you need to depress the small button. On the FM2, there's no button, so it freely turns. If I pop the back again, I'll quickly show the inside of the camera. Here's the inside of the camera. Very similar to most SLR cameras. You have your pressure plate here, and then to load fresh film, you load your cassette here, pull the leader across, fit it into the small gap here. So you push your film leader into the gap, advance your film to make sure it's caught, shut the back, and you're good to go. So that's kind of a basic overview of the similar characteristics on most of these cameras. And now the question comes, which of these cameras is the best? When you're looking on eBay or in a shop, for example, what do you buy? Do you buy an FM, an FM2, an FE, an FE2, or an FM3a? So the second part of this video is hopefully now going to be more value add, and I'll show you the exact differences between the different cameras. I'll put some tables together so we can compare side by side which is the best camera for you or for me. I'll also tell you my favourite at the end and why. So what I've done, excuse the iPad, I've done a series of screens which I'll display in a second, and I'll talk you through the differences. It's like being back at school, isn't it? So if you can bring up my first slide. So here are the 5/6 models in this camera series. It goes in kind of chronological order, so earliest camera to the latest camera. So the first camera released on the left hand side was a Nikon FM 1977. Followed that was a Nikon FE 1978. Then came the Nikon FM2 1982. I'll come back to that in a second. Next was the Nikon FE2 1983. And then if we go back to the middle, 1984 came the Nikon FM2n, which included a few modifications. And finally on the right hand side, 2001 they released the Nikon FM3a. So I tried to design this slide to make it easy for people to visualize. Obviously what you can see is where a camera is called FM, it uses a mechanical shutter. Mechanical shutter means you don't need batteries to operate the camera, and only uses the 2 coin batteries to operate the light meter. Where it says FE, again these cameras only use the 2 small coin batteries, exactly the same batteries as in the FM models, but without these batteries you cannot use most of the functionality of the camera, and I'll comment to that in a second. So if you look on the left hand side, the Nikon FM has the manual shutter, and that offers you speeds of 1 second to 1,000th of a second, and a flash sync speed of 1/125. If you compare that to the Nikon FE, the Nikon FE offers shutter speeds of 8 seconds through to 1,000th of a second. So straight away, if you enjoy night photography and say you use a tripod, the FE may be better for you because it offers 8 seconds kind of timed releases without needing to say time it with a cable release. The same goes for the Nikon FM2 versus the FE2. The FM slower shutter speed is 1 second, and the FE2 with the electronic shutter is 8 seconds. So if that's important to you, look at the FE models in this instance. Now as we go down, so we've got shutter speed, then below that we have the maximum flash sync speed. The maximum flash sync speed of the earlier models, the FM and the FE, was 1/125. Then came the Nikon FM2, which had a flash sync speed of 1/200. Next came the FE2, which had a flash sync speed of 1/250. And then they released the Nikon FM2n, which was modified to now also offer 1/250. And then the same 1/250 was also offered with the Nikon FM3a. Now on the next line down, on the left hand side, you see the word all under Nikon FM. That means you can use all shutter speeds all the time without needing any batteries in the camera. That is also true for the Nikon FM2 and the Nikon FM3a. You will notice under the Nikon FE it says M190. Now the camera is designed that even with no batteries loaded, if you set the camera to 1/90, you can still fire the shutter. So here's the Nikon FE, and you can see it says M90 on the top. So at the moment we're set to, what are we set to? 1/60. So I'll fire the shutter. And if you just bought this camera from eBay, and you press the shutter and nothing happened, you'd be like, ah, they've sold me a dead camera. I need to send it back. And I must admit, I've not used this camera for a while, and I'll tell you why later on. And I got the camera out last night ready for the video, cut the shutter, nothing happened. I'm like, oh no, I've got a dead camera. And then I realised maybe there's no batteries in. I put batteries in and it fired straight away. And then I realised, oh, but I don't need batteries. So I took the batteries back out, changed the setting to, you hear it just fire, changed the setting to M90, and now you can cut the shutter all day long, but only at 1/90. If I changed it to any other setting, we'll change it to 1/250, cut the shutter, nothing. And you see the mirror stays up inside the camera. If you see this, turn it back to M90, and there you go, and we're good to go again. So your Nikon FE, you need to shoot it at 90th of a second without a battery, and on the later Nikon FE2, you need to use 1/250. So in this instance, if you're trying to decide between the FE and the FE2, if you're worried about running out of batteries and you're in the middle of nowhere on some trip, 1/90 is potentially a much more usable shutter speed, if that's your only shutter speed, than 1/250. Personally, I'd say 1/250 is too fast as your only shutter speed option, which would then make the FE potentially more desirable than the FE2. So just to be aware of what we're talking about shutter speeds. Okay, back to the slide. So as you can see then, under the Nikon FE, it says M 1/90, and on the FE2 it says M 1/250. The final point on this slide before we move to the next slide, I also noted the weight. So you notice that the Nikon FM and FE weigh 590 grams, which is around 21 ounces. The Nikon FM2 is 540 grams, 19 ounces. The Nikon FE2, 550 grams, 19.4 ounces, excuse me. And the Nikon FM3a, 570 grams, 20 ounces. So again, if you're like me and you like lightweight cameras, in this instance, you'd be better to go for the FM2 or FE2, with the FM2/FM2n being slightly lighter. Now, one reason why the earlier cameras are heavier is because the FM and FE had the standard shutter that looks like this. And then for the FE2 and the FM2, they upgraded the cameras to this titanium honeycomb shutter. Can you see the honeycomb design? Which was a lighter weight. And then if you're like me and you're trying to work out which camera to buy on eBay, and you're trying to work out what is a Nikon FM2 and an FM2n, don't assume that all Nikon FM2s and Nikon FM2ns have the titanium shutter, because they don't. The latest versions of the Nikon FM2n has the new aluminium shutter, which is able to give the same high speed as the titanium shutter of 1/250th of a second and a maximum shutter speed of 1/4000. But it looks close in its design to the earlier Nikon FM, Nikon FE, but those earlier cameras only offer the maximum shutter speed of 1/1000. Okay, so I know we've just covered a lot of detail. So before we get to slide 2, let's take a quick break and look at some photos to let our brains recover a bit. Or for those of you that have fell asleep, I'll try and wake you up with a few images. Okay, so I guess I'm pointing out the obvious, but I'll say it anyway for people that are maybe new to photography. It doesn't matter which camera you're using from the cameras we're looking at today. All of these cameras take identical photos. The only thing that is important is the lens on the front and the film on the inside. If you use the same lens on any of these cameras and the same film on any of these cameras, and for example, for argument's sake, use a maximum shutter speed of 1/1000, you'll get exactly the same photo. So for that reason, I'm not going to label this photo is taken with a Nikon FM, this photo is taken with a Nikon FE2, for example, because it really doesn't matter. So rather than distract you at this point during a class, we'll start off with some non-model photos and we'll ease into it, and then we'll do some model photos if you last till the end of the lecture or class, or the third slide. There's 3 slides to go through, and we've done 1, so we're a third of the way through, and more than halfway through the video, I would guess. Okay, so for some background narrative, while I show you the pictures, I actually got the Nikon FM as one of my first film cameras in 2012, and at that time I had to travel quite a lot with my work, so I had this camera with me when I was working in India in 2013, which allowed me to get some kind of typical India shots at that time, kind of wandering around the streets during the weekend. And then more recently, I took the Nikon FM and the Nikon FE2 on a road trip where I flew into Hungary, and then I took various buses, trains, taxis to get from Hungary into Ukraine and back again. So I use these cameras to try and document the trip. So these are photos taken in transit going from Hungary, Budapest in Hungary, through to Ukraine. And as a taste of what's to come, here are a few photos shot in Ukraine with some of the girls. Okay, enough of that. Let's get on to slide 2 and then we'll get back to more pictures. Okay, slide 2 is getting into the finer details, but it is important if you're trying to decide which camera to buy, so it is worth looking at. So again, same cameras. You'll notice that the Nikon FM and the FM2 have the +0- LED light meter diode that we spoke about. And then the FE, FE2, FM3a have the needle light meter display. I would say the needle display is so much nicer as the one that owns both cameras, but the +0- display functions just the same way. These are center weighted light meters, and I believe the center weighted meter is roughly the size of the circle on the center of the focus screen. So next line down, you can see that all cameras offer the double exposure option. It's just the Nikon FM has a slightly different button design. Okay, now you'll notice where I've put FM and FE, I've put the K screen. So the standard screen which came with the Nikon FM and FE was called the K screen. The difference being the Nikon FM screen is fixed and cannot be replaced. The Nikon FE screen can be replaced, and the same was true for all later models. When it came to the Nikon FM2, FE2 and FM3a, they fitted these cameras with the new K2 screen, which is a much brighter screen, and it makes it much easier for focusing. And then for the cameras where you can change the screen, there are 3 types of, as I remember. I'll note it above if I'm wrong. There's the B screen, which is kind of a plain screen. There's the standard K screen, which has the micro prisms and the split image in the center, which is my preferred style. And then there's the E screen, or architecture screen, which is basically a grid. Now, when I bought my Nikon FE, this came fitted with a grid screen in camera. And for that reason, I've never actually used this camera. Why? Because I cannot see to focus, critically focus, when I don't have the split image display in the center. So for anybody looking for a Nikon FE, drop me a message, because I will sell this at some point. All the other cameras I have the split image in the center and then a micro prism display around the outside. And this is my preferred way to focus. And at this point in the video, I'll turn the tables onto you for a second. Question from me to professional Nikon shooters or very experienced Nikon shooters. My question is, how do you critically focus on a close-up subject? Do you focus first with the split image on the center and then recompose? Or do you ignore the split image and try and compose through the kind of the milky kind of screen on the outside of the image? Originally, I used to try and recompose, but what I find is for some of my portraits, I have off-center subjects. And so for that reason, what I started doing is ignoring the image in the center of the screen, and instead I just tried to focus the subject on the edge of the focus screen without using the center. Please tell me if that's the best way to do it, because I'm still a lucky shooter at heart, so I'm kind of learning as I go. Both ways seems to work, but I didn't know if there was a recommended way, whether to recompose or to just ignore the center display and kind of try and focus without using the split image. That's my question to the class. Now, if you're a fan of using vintage Nikon lenses, pre-AI lenses, you need to be aware that you can only use pre-AI lenses on the Nikon FM or the Nikon FE. There's a very slightly different design with a pin here, and that pin allows you to use the pre-AI lenses as well as all later lenses. So this, for example, is an AI lens, and this lens will work on all the cameras, but the pre-AI lens will not work on a Nikon FM2, Nikon FE2 or Nikon FM3a. And then to be clear, when I say all later lenses will work on these cameras, I would say most later lenses will work on these cameras. Everything up to, I think, the D range. So if, say, you use the autofocus Nikon 51.8D, that lens will work on all of these cameras, but obviously you have to use manual focus. Now, the lenses that came after that, the G lenses will not work on any of these cameras. The difference with the G lenses, you have no aperture ring on these lenses. But saying that, I thought, oh, no problem. The lens will just be stuck open at f1.8 and I'll still get photos. I like to try and take the practical approach. So yesterday, I fitted the 51.8G onto the Nikon FE to film test the Nikon FE, and also did a few shots on Nikon FM2 to film test the FM2. I can 100% confirm you get 0 photos if you fit a G lens onto any of these cameras. In my head, I thought the lens would stay open and then the shutter would work as normal, and that would take the photo, thinking at a basic level. But what seems to happen is the lens somehow seems to stay open and let in too much light, and so you just get a blank image. So G lenses will not fit any of these cameras, just to be aware. And obviously any Nikon lenses made for non-Nikon F mount will not fit these cameras. So for example, rangefinder lenses will not fit a Nikon F camera. Pointing out the obvious, I realised. And then finally on slide 2, all of these cameras except the MD12 motor drive, which as I say fits onto the base of the camera. I don't actually own a motor drive, but what it basically means is it turns your FM or FE into a camera size similar to the Nikon F5, and by that you have a battery grip on the bottom, again with 8 AA batteries, the same as the Nikon F5. If you didn't see that video, I can link it below as well. And then the way the motor drive works is it will auto advance your film, but it will not auto rewind your film. On the Nikon F5, it auto advances your film and it auto rewinds your film. So if you want auto rewind, it might be better to look at the pro range bodies rather than the mid range bodies. I believe with the motor drive fitted, these cameras shoot at I think 3.5 frames a second, and it does sound very cool. So maybe I'll have to get one just for the sound effect at some point. Okay, so we've completed slide 2. Would you like to see some more photos? Okay, so let's go back to my trip in Ukraine, and these are some model photos taken with the Nikon FE2. I believe I was using the Viewfinder 40mm f2 lens, and I believe the Nikon 55 f2.8 micro. If you want me to do a review of my favourite lenses for the Nikon system, drop me a message in the comments below and I'll maybe try and put something together before Christmas so you can write your shopping list for Santa. It's worth pointing out the obvious again, but you can get some really good optics for Nikon cameras, which will give you then similar photos in my mind to photos taken with my Leica rangefinder film cameras. I wouldn't say I can tell the difference in most cases. So all of those shots were taken with the Nikon FE2. Okay, one more slide to go, then I'll give you some more photos and then we'll do a quick roundup on which is the best camera for you. So this will be a quick slide and it basically tries to point out the common features found on all models. So all of these cameras have the built-in light meter that function with 2 LR44 coin batteries which go into the base of the camera. And this is a center weighted light meter. All of these cameras offer the self timer, and all these cameras also offer the depth of field preview button. All cameras have the PC sync port on the front of the camera for linking to, say, Studio Flash. And obviously it's not written, but all cameras have the hot shoe as well. Again, all Nikon cameras have the shutter lock. Some people like that, some people don't, which basically means you need to have the advanced lever out, as we looked at earlier. Otherwise you cannot take your photo. And again, as already mentioned earlier, the main difference on the Nikon FM and Nikon FE, if you have your advanced lever open, it's going to flatten your battery. Whereas on the later models, there's no red dot, so you can leave the lever open and it will not flatten your battery. So you only need to worry about that on the FM FE. And finally, as already mentioned, all cameras have the threaded shutter release buttons. Again, one difference to note on the FM and FE, they are threaded on the inside and the outside, so you can use kind of the older style of shutter release cables. Where on the FM2 and FE2 and FM3a, it's only threaded on the inside, so you can only use cables with that type of threading. So you'd be glad to hear that is the end of the slides, and the question you may have now is, which camera should I buy? Which is the best mid-range Nikon SLR camera to buy? FM, FE, FM2, FE2, FM2n or FM3a? So of these 6 cameras, which is the best for you? Now, arguably, Nikon tried to advance the cameras with each kind of iteration. So in theory, the best camera is the Nikon FM3a, released in 2001. I don't actually own a Nikon FM3a, and I'll tell you why in a second. But it's an interesting camera because it's basically taken the best functionality from a FM model and the best functionality from a FE camera, and then basically put them together to make a hybrid camera. By that I mean it's the only camera which will give you 0.004 of a second maximum shutter speed with no batteries. So let's say, for example, you're planning a trip and you're trying to decide which camera to take, and you're going to go to the North Pole, or you're going to go and do desert safari for 2 months, or you're going to go to the Amazon rainforest. Firstly, all these cameras are potentially very good for this because they've proven to be extremely robust and work in high temperatures, low temperatures and high humidity. So all of these cameras could be good, but if there's a chance that your batteries may run out, and as I say, you're in the North Pole, for example, the Nikon FM3a would be the best camera to take with you. I guess the North Pole is a good example because it's going to be very bright from the reflection from the sun, meaning you may want the maximum shutter speed of 1/4000, just thinking kind of as a photographer, a real life situation. So in those circumstances, and again, I guess with the desert, in those circumstances, the FM3a is better than the Nikon FE2 because it doesn't require batteries. What about the Nikon FM2? The Nikon FM2 is good, but it has the kind of the older style meter, the kind of the plus, zero, minus. And from personal taste, I think the needle dial is much more refined and gives a much nicer camera display. So functionality, the FM2 would do the same job as the FM3a and doesn't need batteries and will work in the desert and the Arctic and blah, blah, blah. But if you'd like the needle dial, you need to get the FM3a. So that's one way of looking at it. Another argument may be you only use pre-AI lenses. If you only use pre-AI lenses, your only options are the FM or the FE. And that's it, simple. And then when it comes to do you want an FM or an FE, that then sparks the next argument. What type of photographer are you? Are you a photographer like myself where you use manual mode and then you manually dial in your shutter speed and then you just use the light meter to tell you what shutter speed to use? Option 1, in which case you can use any of the cameras, but you can make use of the FM models, the mechanical shutter cameras, because these cameras don't have auto mode, no auto exposure, aperture priority you call it. The Nikon FE, the Nikon FE2 and the Nikon FM3a all offer aperture priority. And you can see that by the green A on the shutter dial. Now I know from seeing other YouTube videos, aperture priority seems very popular amongst other photographers. So if you are a aperture priority type shooter, the only 3 cameras you can look at is the FE, FE2 or FM3a. And so then you may think, well, which camera is going to last the longest? Now with any camera using electronics, there's a chance the electronics will fail. If the electronics fail on an FM or an FM2 or an FM3a, it's not really the end of the world. The light meter won't work, but the camera's still fully functional. So again, if it's your only camera and you're in the North Pole and you've got a polar bear about to bite your head off and you've got a chance to get that once in a lifetime shot, if you're using a Nikon FE or FE2 and the electronics suddenly fail on the camera, you're going to get your head bitten off by the polar bear and have nothing to show for it. Whereas on the Nikon FM, Nikon FM2, Nikon FM3a, they don't rely on electronics. So you'll be able to get your kind of bear close-up shot before it bites your head off and at least have something to show for the experience. So joking aside, FM cameras should outlast FE cameras. And for those of you who have watched the channel before, you will know I have a strong preference for manual cameras versus cameras with electronics. That said, I do use cameras with electronics and without electronics, but ideally all cameras would have no electronics and then I would never have anything to worry about. I'm thinking of cameras like the Hasselblad X-Pan, cameras which are now quite expensive, and if the electronics fail, you've just lost a really nice camera. Well, at least on something like a Hasselblad 500, there's no electronics, so they're going to just go on and on and on. Same for obviously Leica 3, Leica M6. So with that said, which is the best? The best is the Nikon FM3a. But, and there is a but, everybody knows it's the best, and so it comes with a massive price tag. Before we get onto the price, which is my favourite? My favourite is actually the Nikon FE2. I had the Nikon FE2 before the Nikon FM2, and then I did some more reading and I thought, why am I using a camera with electronics when I can use a lighter camera without electronics, which is going to last much longer potentially? So it's like, I must have been smoking something on that day. I'll go and buy an FM2. So I bought the Nikon FM2 to replace the FE2, and then I was going to sell the FE2. And then when I received the FM2, I looked through the viewfinder and thought, it's okay, it's not quite as pleasing to the eye as the FE2. So I think I'm actually going to just keep using my FE2. It just does the job, and I really like the needle light meter. The FM2 will obviously do exactly the same job, but has the more basic light meter. And so the important part, how much do these cameras cost? And then I promise I'll show you more pictures. Okay, so in order, cheapest to most expensive. The cheapest camera you can get is the Nikon FE, costing from £100 upwards, which is around $130 US. Next, you have the Nikon FM, which starts at around £150, which is around $200. Next, the FE2, £200 or $260. Nikon FM2, £250, which is $325 approximately. And then lastly, Nikon FM3a. So at the moment we're going small increments. We're doing 100, 150, 200, 250. It's like being at an auction. And then what happens? Nikon FM3a, £750. So we're jumping from 250 FM2 to the Nikon FM3, which basically does exactly the same job. £750 or more, between £750 up to £1,000, which is basically starting price of $1,000 or more. That's a lot of money for a Nikon SLR film camera. The argument is, if you want to buy once and you do have that once in a lifetime trip around the world, the Nikon FM3a doesn't rely on electronics, and so that camera is in theory the best camera for the job. But you could argue you could buy 3 Nikon FM2s, and then you have 2 backup bodies if one steals or you lose your first body. Whereas if you've only got one Nikon FM3a and you lose it, it's game over, photos finished. start using kind of your iPhone. So in all seriousness, the Nikon FM3a is expensive. It's expensive because it's got the most features, it's the newest, and I believe it wasn't made in huge quantities. So for that reason, it's even more desirable. For me personally, £750 is too much money to pay for a Nikon. You could pick up a Leica M film camera for that. So I think best bang for your buck, and especially if you enjoy using aperture priority mode or auto, get the Nikon FE. It's the cheapest. You'll notice the FE models are cheaper than the FM models, because the FM models seem to me more desirable because of the lack of electronics, and therefore they should last much longer. Now let me pull up a few more photos just to inspire you. These photos are shot with the Nikon FM and the Nikon FE2. Here are some photos shot in Poland. I think these are shot on expired Kodak BW400 black and white film. And again, using the same cameras, here are some photos shot in France. I went to France last year and I took only the FM and the FE2 and no Leica. I normally always carry a Leica camera, so I thought I'd try one trip with only Nikon cameras. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you back here for the next video. Bye.